the Bank of England is in a very unenviable position of trying to target supply-side inflation with demand-side tools.
Do you think, in many regards, the government, commentators, everyone else should be a bit more honest and frank about the fact that if you want to bring inflation under control, it frankly does mean economic pain?
And I think they have. The Bank of England has signalled that we are potentially heading into a recession, and we've already seen that come through in the economic data. In Q1 GDP, we saw a contraction for the month of March. Also, when we look at some of the other gauges, like consumer confidence figures or retail sales, we're starting to see that all soften. So I think it is pretty clear from the Bank of England and the government that we are looking towards either a soft or hard landing, economically speaking, before hopefully we get a pickup at some point next year.
And just very finally, what do you make about this idea of a windfall tax? I mean, it's been done in the past to banks and other places. There is an argument, isn't there? And, Labour Party have been making this quite strongly. Some within the Conservative Party have been making this quite strongly, that effectively you have this one-off tax that you then target at those who've been hit hardest.
Yeah, I mean, it's a difficult one because on the one hand, the reason why some of these oil giants like BP and Shell have been doing so well is because of the war in Ukraine. It's not because of necessarily their business fundamentals that have been meaning that they've been doing really well. But at the same time, the other argument goes, well, they were loss-making back in 2020 when oil prices went negative. There wasn't any financial support for them then. But clearly something needs to be done about the cost of living crisis.
It does, but there is also a kind of discussion about investment, isn't there? That seems to be the main argument against it, that energy companies won't invest if you hyphen off these profits. But then the alternative view is, well, these are profits they didn't expect to make. So actually the investment money had already been put aside. Is that fair?
I mean, it's a really difficult one to say. I think that a lot of these oil companies actually did think that they were going to be faced with a windfall tax and weren't necessarily even against it themselves. They haven't come out saying, we desperately don't want this. So I think it is a really interesting policy that needs to be considered.
And just very, very finally, on this idea of a recession, I mean, what's your thought? Is it almost inevitable now, given where we're at, given that inflation's looking at, 10% by the end of the year?
I think it almost is inevitable, and it's just a technicality as to whether we see what the definition of a recession is, which is 2 consecutive quarters of negative growth. We could possibly just about avoid it by seeing 0% growth or 0.1% growth in one of those quarters. But it's clear that the next 2 quarters are going to be very, very challenging economically.
Yeah, because March, if that month alone, we saw that negative growth, didn't we?
Exactly. We saw that surprise shock to the downside in March. If that were to extend into the second and third quarter, then we'd be in a technical recession.